Something is wrong with the radio. Not the static. Static is expected. Expected in the way a fireplace crackles or a river murmurs. White noise that we have learned to fold into the background of our waking lives. This is something else. This is a voice. A voice in the dead hours of 1927, crackling through the speaker of a receiver in a Norwegian engineer's home study. 3 seconds after the voice first spoke. 3 seconds too late. 3 seconds too impossible to explain. The voice is his own voice, echoed back from somewhere across the sky. Except that's not how echoes work. Not 3-second echoes. Not from a signal aimed straight up and returned from... where exactly? No one knows. That's where this story begins. In the crackling dark of the radio age, when millions of people first pressed their ears to this miraculous new technology and heard, sometimes, things that should not have been there. Things that science would try and fail to fully explain. Things that a frightened, grieving, wondering world would call by many names: interference, atmospheric anomaly, mass hysteria, madness. And sometimes, in the quietest hours, ghosts. Imagine the world before the radio, not the world before the internet. That still feels within living memory for many of us. A world of slow information, of newspapers and party lines and word of mouth. Go further back than that. Go back to the world before wireless, before the voice could travel without wires, before sound could become invisible and cross oceans in an instant. A world where if you wanted to know what was happening 3 cities over, you waited. You read about it tomorrow or next week, or perhaps never. Now imagine the first time you heard a voice come out of a box. Not a phonograph voice, scratchy, metallic, recognizably mechanical. A live voice, a voice speaking words that were being spoken at that exact moment by a living human being hundreds of miles away. And the voice was coming to you through the air, through walls, through nothing visible at all. In 1927, this was not science fiction. This was not imagination. This was what millions of Americans and Europeans and Australians were experiencing for the first time in their parlours, on their farms, in their cramped city apartments, pressing headphones to their ears with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. Because that's what radio felt like. Prayer. A transmission into the invisible. By 1927, there were approximately 700 licensed broadcast stations in the United States alone. 700 voices launched into the ether, aimed at a nation of 7.5 million radio receivers, and growing. Charles Lindbergh had just crossed the Atlantic in 33.5 hours, and every step of that journey, the takeoff, the tracking, the desperate hours of silence, the triumphant landing, had been followed in near real time by a civilization that was, for the first time in history, sharing experience simultaneously. Not reading about it the next morning, knowing it as it happened, feeling it together, across distance, in the dark. Radio had done something no technology had ever done before. It had collapsed time and space in a way that felt, to ordinary people living through it, frankly, miraculous. The Radio Act of 1927 was signed into law that February, creating the Federal Radio Commission, the first attempt by any government to impose order on what had become a genuinely chaotic airspace. Hundreds of stations crowded the frequencies, talking over each other, bleeding into each other, their signals mixing in ways that the engineers of the era only partially understood. The ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of atmosphere high above the Earth, the invisible mirror that bounces radio waves across continents, was not yet well mapped. Shortwave signals could travel without warning to the other side of the world and return distorted, delayed, changed. The science of radio propagation was being written in real time, and the men and women writing it were doing so in conditions that made every unusual signal, every unexpected voice, every inexplicable echo feel like a message from somewhere unknown. In 1927, most people did not know what the ionosphere was. They did not know about skip propagation, about tropospheric ducting, about the Van Allen belts that wouldn't be discovered for another 3 decades. What they knew was this. Sometimes the radio said things it shouldn't have been able to say. Shortwave radio operators, the amateur hobbyists, the hams, who were among the most technically sophisticated civilians of their era, kept detailed logs. These logs are historical documents now, preserved in ham radio societies and university archives across the world. And what these logs describe, through the carefully neutral language of technical observation, is extraordinary. Signals received from directions they shouldn't have come from. Voices speaking languages no one in the room could identify. Music that predated any known recording. The same signal heard twice, minutes apart. The second reception impossible under any known atmospheric model. These were not simple men. These were not credulous rural farmers hearing things in the wind. These were men who understood oscillators and crystal filters, who could read an oscilloscope and calculate signal strength in milliwatts. When they wrote received unknown transmission, source unverifiable, possible ionospheric anomaly, they were being as precise as their science allowed. And when they wrote I have no explanation for this, they meant it. The year 1927 is our fulcrum. It is the year radio came of age, and the year the first documented, scientifically reported, scientifically unexplained ghost signal appeared in the scientific literature. Not in a ghost story, not in the yellow press, in a communication that would eventually be published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth. The signal would be examined, debated, re-examined, and theorized about for the rest of the century. It has not been explained yet, but to understand why that signal was so shattering, why a 3-second delay could tear open such a fault line between what we know and what we don't, we have to go back a little further. To the men who built the machine that would receive it. To the pioneers who, before anyone else, admitted that what they were hearing was impossible. And one of them, it must be said, was utterly terrified. His name was Nikola Tesla, and he was alone in his laboratory in the mountains of Colorado on a night in the summer of 1899 when the numbers started. Not words, not voices. Numbers, or what seemed like numbers. Regular rhythmic pulses arriving through his receiver in a pattern too ordered to be random, too deliberate to be natural atmospheric static. He was in Colorado Springs, 6,800 feet above sea level, in an enormous wooden laboratory he had built specifically to conduct atmospheric electrical experiments. He had erected a 200-foot antenna mast topped with a copper ball and was sending enormous electrical charges into the earth and into the sky, probing the planet's electromagnetic resonance in ways that had never been attempted before. He was, in every measurable sense, the most advanced electrical experimenter in the world. And what he heard frightened him. "My first observations positively terrified me," he would later write, "as there was present in them something mysterious, not to say supernatural, and I was alone in my laboratory at night." He was careful. He was methodical. He checked his equipment for faults. He ruled out terrestrial sources one by one. The signals continued, regular and patterned, and Tesla, the man who had single-handedly developed alternating current, the man who had lit the 1893 World's Fair with electricity, the man whom his contemporaries considered a near supernatural genius, concluded that he was receiving a transmission from another world. He published his account 2 years later, in 1901, in Collier's Weekly, in an article he titled "Talking with the Planets." He wrote that the signals were undoubtedly of intelligent origin, and that he believed they originated from Mars, then widely thought to be possibly inhabited. The scientific community was skeptical. Science historians today suggest he may have been detecting natural radio emissions from Jupiter. Jupiter emits powerful radio waves at frequencies that fall within the range of 1890s receivers, and this phenomenon was not understood until 1955. But Tesla was never able to prove his theory, and he never fully retreated from it. What matters here is not whether Tesla was right about where the signals came from. What matters is what a man of his caliber, the most sophisticated electromagnetic experimenter on the planet, believed he had heard. He heard intelligence. He heard pattern. He heard something that should not have been there. And he was not alone. Guglielmo Marconi, who would win the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics for his development of wireless telegraphy, began making public statements in the early 1920s that his competitors and colleagues found deeply uncomfortable. Marconi had been experimenting with very long wavelength radio transmissions and claimed to have received signals he could not explain. In 1921, according to press reports of the period, he told interviewers that he believed the wireless medium might someday allow communication with those who had died, that signals travelling through the ether might, in some form, include the voices of the departed. He said he had received transmissions from unknown sources that he could not trace to any living transmitter. These statements were reported as somewhat embarrassing by the scientific press. Here was the father of practical radio, the man whose technology had given the world wireless communication, musing in public about ghosts. The easy explanation, and the one most historians have preferred, is that Marconi was aging, perhaps unwell, possibly shaped by the spiritualist movement that was sweeping through European intellectual circles in the wake of the devastating losses of the First World War. But consider this. Marconi was one of the most experienced radio engineers alive. He had been listening to radio signals longer than almost anyone on Earth. If anyone could distinguish an unusual but explicable atmospheric phenomenon from something genuinely anomalous, it was him. And he chose the word impossible. And then there was Thomas Edison. In the autumn of 1920, the inventor of the phonograph, the incandescent light bulb, and motion pictures, gave an interview to Scientific American magazine in which he revealed that he had been working on a machine to communicate with the dead. He was careful, characteristically, to frame this in pragmatic terms. "I don't claim that our personalities pass on to another existence or sphere," he said. "I don't claim anything, because I don't know anything." But then he went further. He said he believed it was possible to construct an apparatus so sensitive that if there were indeed personalities existing in another existence or sphere who wished to communicate with the living, such an apparatus would give them a better opportunity to do so than... And here Edison used language that tells you everything about what he thought of the competition. The tilting tables and rapping and Ouija boards and mediums and the rest of the current nonsense. Edison was not a mystic. He was the most famous pragmatist in American history, a man defined by his rejection of the unprovable and his devotion to the empirical. He was the man who said genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And yet, here he was, in 1920, in the pages of Scientific American, describing a project to build a radio for the dead. The device was never completed, or if it was, no record of it survives. What survives is the interview, Edison's own words, published, documented, a matter of historical record, sitting in archives in the pages of a science magazine for more than a century. These three men, Tesla, Marconi, Edison, were not credulous. They were not prone to fantasy. They were, collectively, the architects of the electromagnetic age. And all three of them, in their lifetimes, made public statements suggesting that the technology they had built was receiving signals, or could receive signals, from somewhere that science did not yet have a name for. That alone should give us pause, but it is the event that happened in Norway in the autumn of 1927 that shifts everything. Because the Norwegian event was not a private belief held by a genius in a mountain laboratory. It was not an aging inventor's idle musing in a magazine. It was a documented, measured, published scientific anomaly, one that is still unexplained, one that when you follow the thread of evidence far enough, leads somewhere very strange indeed. On a dark evening in late 1927, a Norwegian engineer named Jørgen Hals was listening to shortwave radio broadcasts from a transmitter in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. A transmitter operated by the Philips Electronics Company, one of the first stations ever to broadcast internationally. The broadcasts were clear. The reception was normal. And then something happened that stopped Hals in his tracks. He heard the broadcast twice. The first reception was clean, expected, unremarkable, the kind of transmission a shortwave operator heard 100 times a week. The second arrived approximately 3 seconds later, not a fraction of a second, not the sub-millisecond delay of a normal atmospheric echo. 3 full seconds. In the physics of radio propagation, a 3-second echo from a terrestrial signal means the signal has travelled an additional 900,000 kilometres, more than twice the distance from the Earth to the Moon. A circumferential echo, a signal travelling all the way around the globe before returning, would produce a delay of approximately 1/7 of a second. Hals was not hearing that. He was hearing something that had gone somewhere 10 times farther than that, somewhere no radio signal should have gone. Hals documented what he heard. He wrote to Carl Sturmer, a Norwegian physicist of international prominence, best known for his mathematical work explaining the aurora borealis and for calculating the orbits of charged particles in Earth's magnetic field. Sturmer was the right man to consult. He understood electromagnetic phenomena at the frontier of scientific knowledge, and Sturmer was immediately, deeply fascinated. Together, Sturmer and Hals conducted further experiments, deliberately transmitting signals and carefully timing the delayed echoes when they occurred. The delays were not consistent. They varied between 3 and 15 seconds, sometimes jumping from one value to another within the same listening session. They verified their equipment. They ruled out local reflections. They checked for any known atmospheric mechanism that might produce such delays, and found none. They confirmed that the echoes were real, genuine delayed returns of signals they had themselves transmitted, returning from a direction that suggested an origin point, somewhere far above the Earth. In 1929, Sturmer and Hals published their findings in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, in a paper titled Echoes of Short Waves. They did not claim to know what caused the phenomenon. They described precisely what they had observed and invited the scientific community to offer explanation. The scientific community read it, discussed it, and found itself baffled. The phenomenon became known as long-delayed echoes, and from 1927 onward, they were reported by radio operators all over the world. Not occasionally, regularly, not in one country, everywhere. Engineers in France, operators in the United States, hobbyists in Australia, all reported receiving their own signals back with delays of seconds, delays that had no physical explanation under any model then available or any model since. The reports accumulated in journals and amateur radio logs for decades. They continue to be reported today. Now, there are things science can say about long-delayed echoes. It can say, with some confidence, that some of them are probably caused by plasma trapped in Earth's magnetosphere, charged particles in the Van Allen radiation belts, discovered in 1958, that can theoretically store and re-emit radio energy. There is mathematics that supports this hypothesis. There are experiments that point in this direction. But here is what the plasma theory does not explain: the variability, the irregularity of the delay times. If the delays were caused by a stable physical mechanism, plasma pockets in the magnetosphere, for instance, the delay times should cluster around predictable values. They do not. They vary in ways that have led physicists, in the sober language of scientific literature, to describe the pattern as, and this is a direct characterization used in academic papers, suggestive of a response rather than a reflection. Something responding, not reflecting. In 1973, 46 years after Sturmer and Hals first documented their echoes, a Scottish astronomer named Duncan Lunan re-examined the original delay sequences. He took the times of the delayed echoes: 3 seconds, 8 seconds, 11 seconds, 15 seconds, and so on, and plotted them on a graph, using the sequence of measurements as a kind of code. What he found made his hands stop moving over the paper. The delay pattern, when visualized, appeared to be a star map. Specifically, a map of a solar system in the constellation Bootes, pointing to a star called Epsilon Bootis, also known as Isar, approximately 203 light-years from Earth. The map appeared to show a star with orbiting planets, one of which was indicated by a displaced point, suggesting it had moved, or had been moved, from its original position. Lunan published his analysis in 1973 and suggested that the long-delayed echoes might be the work of an automated alien probe, a concept known in the scientific literature as a Bracewell probe, named for the Stanford radio astronomer Ronald Bracewell, who had proposed in 1960 that an advanced alien civilization might place automated devices near inhabited solar systems to announce their presence. Lunan's argument was that such a probe, detecting our radio transmissions, had begun reflecting them back with deliberate delays that encoded a map pointing to its home star system. Lunan later identified errors in his initial analysis and retracted specific elements of his interpretation. He was honest about that. He corrected his math. But here is what he did not retract. The delay sequences are real. The echoes Sturmer and Howells documented are real. The pattern Lunan observed, even after correction, remains a pattern that has not been explained by any other means. No one has explained the long-delayed echoes. Not fully, not to everyone's satisfaction, not in 100 years of effort by physicists across the world. Somewhere, out there, in the frequencies above the Earth, a 3-second delay in a 1927 radio broadcast from the Netherlands is still asking the question, where did you go, and what brought you back? The long-delayed echoes were science's mystery, precise, documented, reproducible, and strange. But alongside the scientific anomaly existed something far harder to measure, the raw human experience of radio weirdness. And in the 1920s and 1930s, that experience was abundant and unsettling. The shortwave bands were wide open in the early days of radio regulation. The Federal Radio Commission, created by the Radio Act of 1927, was primarily concerned with medium-wave broadcast frequencies, the stations playing music and news to home listeners. The shortwave spectrum, vast and labyrinthine, was left largely to amateur operators who ranged across it at will, listening and transmitting, and encountering with considerable regularity things they could not explain. The logs of the American Radio Relay League, the organization founded in 1914 to represent amateur radio operators, still active today, contain reports from the 1920s and 1930s of operators receiving transmissions with no identifiable source. Some of these were clearly ionospheric anomalies, European stations bouncing off the ionosphere and arriving in America with no apparent point of origin, a phenomenon not yet understood. But others were more difficult to dismiss. Operators received what appeared to be coded transmissions in patterns that didn't match any known format. Operators received music that predated any known recording. Operators received, on multiple occasions, voice broadcasts in languages that no one present could identify. Languages that weren't supposed to be on those frequencies at all. This is where documented history begins to shade into what radio men called the law of the shortwave, the stories that passed from operator to operator, preserved not in institutional records, but in the oral culture of a community that spent its nights in the dark with headphones on, listening for the world, and sometimes hearing something else entirely. The documentation is thin here, archival and second-hand, lost to the shuffle of institutional record-keeping across a century. It cannot be verified to modern evidentiary standards. It is preserved as a story that radio men told each other because it matched something they had themselves felt. The cold sensation of an unexplained signal. The particular quality of stillness that falls over a room when the receiver delivers something that should not be there. But there are mysterious radio accounts that are far harder to dismiss because they come with institutional authority and governmental acknowledgement. And in some cases, they are still happening. The number stations, shortwave radio transmitters broadcasting streams of numbers, letters and tones in clearly coded formats, have been documented since the First World War, when various militaries used them for one-way communications with agents in the field. A recorded message broadcast on a frequency known only to the recipient, read by an anonymous voice, decipherable only by someone holding the corresponding cipher. The perfect spy communication. No transmission, no receiver, no risk. Just a voice in the static, and the knowledge that someone out there is listening. The number stations should have ended with the Cold War. Many did, but many did not. And then there is UVB 76, Somewhere in Russia, a radio transmitter has been broadcasting a buzzing tone since at least 1973. Likely earlier. The tone buzzes approximately 25 times per minute, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It never stops. It does not go off the air on weekends. It does not go silent on holidays. It does not acknowledge the passage of time or the fall of governments. On rare occasions, startling, unexplained occasions, the buzzing tone is interrupted by a human voice reading a string of numbers and names in Russian, following no apparent schedule, and then the tone resumes. Radio enthusiasts and intelligence analysts have monitored UVB-76 continuously for decades. They have named it the buzzer. They have logged every transmission. They have built communities and websites and forums devoted to tracking its transmissions. No government has ever officially acknowledged operating it. No one has deciphered its purpose. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the buzzer kept buzzing. When the Russian Federation replaced it, the buzzer kept buzzing. Right now, as you listen to this, UVB-76 is on the air somewhere in Russia, transmitting its 25 buzzes per minute into the shortwave spectrum, broadcasting to someone or something, for a reason that no one outside a locked room in a building that doesn't appear on maps will confirm. The voice in the static speaks, sometimes. Then the static returns. But perhaps the most viscerally disturbing documented radio phenomenon in this entire story is not the long-delayed echoes, not the number stations, not the unexplained broadcasts that radio men logged and whispered about in the dark. Perhaps the most disturbing documented radio phenomenon is what happened on a Sunday evening in New Jersey in October of 1938, because what happened then tells us something profound. Not about what radio was transmitting, but about what radio was capable of doing to the human mind. On the night of October 30th, 1938, the Columbia Broadcasting System Network aired a radio drama based on H.G. Wells's science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds, produced and directed by a 23-year-old man named Orson Welles. The drama was presented in the style of a live news broadcast, a dance band program interrupted by breaking reports of explosions on Mars, then by on-scene correspondents describing the landing of a Martian cylinder in a field in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, then by increasingly desperate reports of Martian war machines obliterating the army and advancing on New York City. An estimated 6 million Americans tuned in to some portion of the broadcast that night. A significant and documented number of them believed, at least temporarily, that it was real. People called police departments across New Jersey. People fled their homes. People packed their belongings and drove into the night. People gathered in churches and prayed. People telephoned family members to say goodbye. All because a voice on the radio told them the world was ending. And here is the insight that unlocks everything about this story, the key that opens the door to understanding what ghost broadcasts meant in 1927. If a clearly fictional drama, presented once, on a medium people had been using for less than 20 years, could produce that level of absolute, terrifying belief, if the human mind was that susceptible to radio as a channel of reality, then consider what the people of the 1920s were experiencing when genuine anomalies appeared, when they heard voices in frequencies where no transmitter was registered, when they received music from no identifiable station, when their own signals came back to them from somewhere impossibly far away. What did they hear? What did they feel? And who did they think was speaking? Here is what science knows. Ionospheric skip, also called skywave propagation, occurs when radio waves at certain frequencies are reflected by the ionosphere and return to Earth at a point far beyond the horizon. The ionosphere is not a fixed ceiling. It fluctuates with the time of day, the season, and the activity of the sun. During periods of high solar activity, skip distances increase dramatically, and stations can be received thousands of miles from their transmitters, arriving with no apparent point of origin. In the early years of radio, before this phenomenon was understood, operators regularly received signals that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Because the transmitting station was on the other side of the world, bouncing its signal off an atmospheric layer no one had fully mapped. Ionospheric skip explains a great deal of what people in the 1920s experienced as ghostly. A voice in an unrecognized language could be a station in Eastern Europe or South America, arriving via an unexpected bounce. Music from no known source could be a distant broadcast, distorted and delayed by multiple reflections. Tropospheric ducting is a related phenomenon. Temperature inversions in the lower atmosphere create channels, waveguides, that trap radio waves and guide them for extraordinary distances, sometimes thousands of miles, in conditions that even experienced operators found bewildering and inexplicable. These phenomena explain a great deal. They explain the phantom signals that unnerved early operators. They explain much of the law. They are real, well-documented physics, and the scientific community is rightfully proud of having eventually mapped them. But, and this is the critical point, these phenomena do not explain long-delayed echoes with delay times of 3 to 15 seconds. The physics simply does not support it. The longest plausible circumferential echo, a radio wave, completing a full circuit of the Earth before returning, would carry a delay of approximately 1/7 of a second. A 3-second delay requires a path length 50 times longer than that. A 15-second delay requires a path length 250 times longer. There is nothing in any known atmospheric model, nothing in any known physics, that produces these numbers through any combination of ionospheric phenomena. In the 1950s, physicists proposed the Van Allen belt hypothesis. Charged plasma trapped in Earth's radiation belts might be able to absorb and re-emit radio energy after a delay. This is the most credible scientific theory currently on the table for LDEs, and it has experimental support. Plasma in the magnetosphere does interact with radio waves. The mathematics is at least plausible. What the Van Allen belt hypothesis does not account for is the patterned variability. The delays are not random noise. They are not stable constants. They form sequences that, in Lunan's analysis, encoded geometric information. Whether that encoding is real or a product of human pattern recognition operating on noisy data is exactly the question that has not been resolved. And it is the question that keeps physicists and astronomers and radio engineers quietly and persistently returning to the original Sturmer-Hals data. What does science say about electronic voice phenomena? The unexplained voices in radiostatic and tape recordings claimed by experimenters like Friedrich Jürgensen and Konstantin Raudive. The scientific consensus is that most, or very nearly all, of what people interpret as EVP is a product of two well-understood cognitive phenomena. Pareidolia, the brain's extraordinary tendency to find patterns, especially voices and faces, in random noise, and apophenia, the perception of meaningful connections in unconnected stimuli. The human brain is the most sophisticated voice recognition machine ever built. It is so powerful at detecting voices that it frequently detects them where none exist. The pattern is real. The voice in these cases is not. But here is the uncomfortable fact that the scientific literature itself acknowledges. Shortwave's recordings were subjected to formal double-blind evaluation by multiple independent audio engineers and researchers. And, while the vast majority of alleged spirit voices could be attributed to pareidolia and apophenia, a small but consistent subset could not be fully explained by any known mechanism. The acoustic patterns were there. They were measurable. Where they originated was not established. Science goes silent at the edge. What it cannot say, what no honest scientist will say, is that there is nothing unusual happening. What it cannot say is that everything is explained. The long-delayed echoes remain in the peer-reviewed literature, unreduced, patient as starlight, waiting for an explanation that has not arrived in nearly 100 years of effort. To understand why the people of 1927 were so primed to hear ghosts in their radios, you have to understand what the world felt like in 1927. The First World War had ended 9 years earlier. 17 million people had died, an incomprehensible number, distributed across every family in every city and village in the industrialized world. A generation had been atomized. Sons and brothers and fathers and husbands had gone to the trenches of Europe and come back as photographs, as telegrams, as folded uniforms, as empty chairs at tables that were never quite full again. The grief was oceanic and unprocessed. There was no vocabulary adequate to it. There were no institutions prepared for it. And into that grief, the spiritualist movement, which had been building since the mid-19th century, had grown into a genuine mass phenomenon, sweeping through every class and profession and level of education in the Western world. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the apostle of rational deduction, the man who had built a literary career on the power of observable evidence and logical inference, had lost his son Kingsley to influenza contracted during the war. In his grief, Conan Doyle had become one of the most vocal and tireless proponents of spiritualism in the English-speaking world. He wrote books. He gave lectures to crowded theatres. He toured the world, arguing that the dead could be reached, that consciousness survived the death of the body, that the great darkness was not the end. And millions of people, not credulous farmers, but doctors and lawyers and scientists and members of parliament, found themselves believing him or wanting to, which in the architecture of grief amounts to the same thing. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in Cambridge in 1882, had spent 40 years investigating claims of supernatural communication with rigorous academic methodology. Its membership over the years had included Nobel laureates, prime ministers, and some of the finest scientific minds of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. These people were not fools. They were not charlatans. They were, many of them, the most rigorous empiricists of their generation. And they devoted years of their careers to the possibility, the serious, documented, peer-reviewed possibility, that something persisted after death, and that it might, under the right conditions, communicate. Into this world came radio, and the spiritualist community immediately, viscerally understood what it meant. If the human voice could travel invisibly through air without wires, if Edison's phonograph could preserve the voices of the dead in physical form, then why, exactly, were people certain that the electromagnetic ether held nothing else? Why were they certain that the frequencies above and below the narrow bands human technology had so far explored were empty? Who had listened to all of them? Who had mapped the full spectrum of what might travel through air? Nobody. That was the answer. In 1927, the electromagnetic spectrum was almost unimaginably vast, and humans were using a tiny sliver of it. The rest, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, and the radio frequencies above and below what early equipment could detect, was entirely unexplored. The idea that consciousness or memory or the residue of a life might persist as some form of electromagnetic signal was not in 1927 provably ridiculous. The science was not there to rule it out. Thomas Edison knew this. Nikola Tesla knew this. Guglielmo Marconi knew this. They were building at the frontier, literally and figuratively, and what they sometimes encountered in that frontier was enough to stop even them. Men who had spent their lives navigating the unknown and emerging with patents and prizes. The spiritual and the electromagnetic had merged in the public imagination by 1927, and radio was the technology at the burning center of that merger. Ghost stories and radio stories were becoming the same stories, processed by the same terrified and hopeful brain, in the same parlors, in the same dark hours of the night. The unexplained voice on the receiver and the unexplained knock at the séance table were being routed through the same emotional architecture. The architecture of a civilization that had been catastrophically wounded and was reaching, with every instrument at its disposal, for contact with what it had lost. Whether that reaching found anything real is a question that has no agreed answer. But the reaching was real, the longing was real, and whatever was in that static, whether it was plasma in the Van Allen belts, or a geometric code from Epsilon Bootis, or the pareidolik trick of a grieving brain, or something that science does not yet have language for, it felt, to the people pressing headphones to their ears in 1927, like something reaching back. Here is what we know. In 1927, a Norwegian engineer named Jørgen Hals heard his own signal come back to him from somewhere beyond the edge of explanation. Carl Sturmer published the result in Nature. Physicists across the world read it, discussed it, and filed it in the growing archive of things that are real and unknown. The echoes continued to be reported for the rest of the century. They are reported still. Nikola Tesla heard something in the mountains of Colorado in 1899 that terrified him, a man who was not easily terrified. Thomas Edison planned a machine to speak to the dead and described it in a science magazine to the reading public. Guglielmo Marconi, the father of practical radio, believed in the last years of his life that he was receiving messages from somewhere outside the circle of living transmitters. These were not weak men. These were not foolish men. These were not men who believed lightly. They were the architects of the age we still live in, and they all looked into the machine they had built and said, "There is something else in here." In the decades that followed, the world kept listening. Friedrich Jürgensen would hear his mother's voice in the static of a Swedish forest in 1959. Konstantin Raudiv would spend a decade recording 100,000 voices that orthodox science could not fully explain away and could not fully confirm. The number stations would broadcast their coded messages into the air from transmitters that officially do not exist, and they broadcast still, right now, as you listen to this, into the same shortwave spectrum where Jørgen Hals first heard his impossible echo nearly a century ago. And here is the thing about ghosts. Ghosts are, fundamentally, a theory about time. The ghost is the thing that should be gone, but isn't. The echo of a person. The residue. the pattern persisting past the event that created it? What if radio, the technology built on the invisible propagation of electromagnetic patterns through space, was always, from its very first crackling transmission, going to find them? What if the medium and the mystery were matched from the beginning? What if the voices we built our machines to carry were only the start, and the machines, inevitably, given enough time and enough sensitive equipment and enough dark, quiet hours with headphones pressed to listening ears, would find the other voices too? The static has always been there. We built receivers to listen to it, and some of what we heard back has never been explained.